stuff that we've covered? Okay, so I bring this up because we left off talking about Alphonse Mucha in here, and we said that he was at the height of popularity in his time. Most of his posters were about twice the size of what we're seeing here, so they went pretty much from ceiling to floor, and that was taking advantage of the printing technology that they had at that day. His stuff really became an emblem for the era. For a lot of people, when they said Art Nouveau, they thought of Alphonse Mucha right away. Others thought of Eugene Grasset, others thought of Jules Cheret. One way or another, these four people, Toulouse-Lautrec, Eugene Grasset, Jules Cheret, and Alphonse Mucha, were all the trendsetters. They were the leaders of this kind of design movement. That's not to say that there weren't other people that were doing stuff that was considered Art Nouveau as well. In fact, if we wanted to, we could say that what the Glasgow Four was doing has elements of Art Nouveau in it, the flattened black outlines that they're utilizing, the long linear shapes, the organic shapes that are inspired by nature, but not necessarily showing nature in its reality, and the again, the organic kind of qualities they have in the letter form. So all of these things have kind of new traits of Art Nouveau, and say that what Peter Behrens was doing, and a lot of stuff that he was doing has elements of Art Nouveau in them too. Or certainly we can look at what was happening with the Vienna Secessionists, and some of the posters and designs that they were doing were Art Nouveau-ish. But they were also pushing the edges on geometrics in the things that they were doing too. So we had this really interesting crossover. All of these things were happening simultaneously. And so if you were living in the time, you were seeing some really excellent designs. And think about this, and simultaneously people were still seeing the stuff of the Victorian era showing up in the works. So we have this really kind of big diversity of styles happening in the period. But Art Nouveau, regardless, was the leading voice as we get into the late 1890s and into the early 1900s. Art Nouveau lasted until about 1910 or so, and then it started to peter off. And by the time we got to 1920, it was considered passé. But we also see that a new style started to develop using Art Nouveau as the catalyst, or the thing that helped to move it into a new category, which we're going to call Art Deco. So it's kind of interesting choice also. The words are very similar. We'll hopefully find a way to be able to separate what those words mean. Art Nouveau is what I want you guys to remember right now. Anybody remember what Art Nouveau means? French word, Liz?
New art.
New art, yeah. And for the French, they didn't call it Art Nouveau. Well, they said Art Nouveau, but to them that literally translated out to mean new art. And a lot of places called this art or new art, until eventually that French word caught on, and people started to refer to it that way. But new art, it was just a general kind of overarching word to describe what was going on, and that kind of categorized what was happening with the Glasgow Four as well, or Peter Behrens. In any case, there were, so far all we've talked about was Art Nouveau in Paris, and again I just kind of pointed out that the other styles could also be considered Art Nouveau, but we know that those were happening in Europe, so in Scotland, in Great Britain, and in Germany, in Austria. So those are all European places. But Art Nouveau came to the United States as well. And the first place that it was actually showed up, that was actually seen, was on the cover for Harper's Magazine. And I've talked about Harper's Magazine before. This looks very different from your typical Harper's Magazine cover. Some of the things that we were looking at, just like from 30 years prior to this, were very over the top. Lots of illustrations, very Victorian in style. But this particular cover was commissioned by Harper's to Eugene Grasset, the French designer, because they wanted to show this new art as part of this issue. So they made it for their Christmas issue, 1892. And immediately after they did this, they hired a designer to take over as an art director at Harper's Publications. The art director's name was Edward Penfield, and this is the next issue, or one of the new issues that he designed for Harper's Magazine. Now, does this look Art Nouveau-ish to you?
No, it's realism.
It looks very realistic. This is still the Victorian style. But once Edward Penfield started to come into the scene, I should say it was a year after, once he came into the scene, he started to apply this new style. And so by the time we get to the July issue of Harper's Magazine, same year, we can see that he's made a full transition over into Art Nouveau. If we were to identify which of the four designers that we were looking at, Eugene Grasset, Jules Charest, Toulouse-Lautrec, or Alphonse Mucha, whose style does this remind you most of? And it could be it reminds you of a couple of them. Whose style does this remind you of?
If it's third guy.
Let's think about the traits that we saw. So Eugene Grasset had traits that looked like what? What was it? What were his? Cassie.
The women looked like intelligent.
Mm-hmm. Does she look intelligent? She does. Okay, so he's taking that from Eugene Grasset. And then when we look at Jules Charest, what did we notice about the line qualities and the stuff that you...
Oh, some Japanese influence stuff.
Mm-hmm. So do we see Japanese influences
Yeah.
here? How?
Well, there's only 1 foot, and like her hat kind of flows into the title of the magazine. And,
and she's floating around in space,
she's got a question
right?
too.
What were you
Sorry, I
going to
was
say?
just going to add the floating world aspect.
Yeah, floating world. There's no background here. Just kind of floating in space, right? So there's that aspect. But look at the line quality here. You've got kind of a sketchy quality where some lines are connected, some aren't connected. We saw that in Jules Charest stuff too. We also saw it in Toulouse-Lautrec stuff. But this is certainly not a dancing girl like we see in Toulouse-Lautrec. But we can definitely see that there's qualities or traits of Jules Charest here. Yes.
Say the last one again. I can't pronounce. I'm bad.
Alphonse Mucha,
No.
Jules Charest, Toulouse-Lautrec.
The face kind of resembles like the faces that he would do. Like it's not super defined.
Very good. Yeah, yeah. And overall, our coloration is very, very flattened in this. I like the typography at the top too. It's kind of, I like how it's integrated in. So Jules Charest did integration of the typography, whereas Toulouse-Lautrec didn't necessarily do that. So did Alphonse Mucha. He integrated the type into the image. So there, we can see that all of these different artists are kind of filtering in or influencing designers. As we move on, and Edward Penfield continues, now we can start to see that the style is becoming more like Toulouse-Lautrec, where he was kind of honing in and creating whole scenes and cropping in on his images, like what we saw of the dancing girls. So we can start to see that happening here in, again, another Harper's poster. Now, in the United States, postering was different there, too. So in Great Britain, we saw postering, you had hoarding sites. In Paris, you could poster any place that you wanted so long as it wasn't a government or a church building. In the United States, they had dedicated sites for posters also, but you had to pay for them. And that's the rule still to this day. If you are going to hang up a poster someplace, it's got to be a dedicated bulletin board or a billboard space. Billboard spaces, we hire companies and we have them hang up our posters for them. So on the highways, when you see those big billboards, that's paid for. And somebody doesn't just come along and hang up whatever poster there. You have to hire the company for it. And that's why we don't see a lot of posters in the United States. The one place that you could hang up signs, and one of the places that they often did in New York City or in the big cities, was at newsstands. So newsstands, you could hire out a portion of that newsstand facade. And so people would have this. Same like the bus stops today. We have bus stops and you can hire out that space and hang up posters. So that was where we would typically see these kinds of posters in the United States. Edward Penfield continued to be the art director for Harper's, but he also went on to do other commissions, other projects. And one of the projects that he did was for a bicycle company called Stearns Bicycles. And I just want to point out here that this is really an interesting poster of women in this time. And I just want to say, why do we think that this is really interesting? What makes this, what sets this woman apart from, you know, what we've been talking about for the Victorian ideal? What do you think, Adam?
Well, it reflects the conservatism of the time. One, the bicycle, and two, basically the bicycle was independence for women back then. So like, Susan B. Anthony and Betsy Ross has said a bicycle has done more for women and for in regards to independence than anything else or something. I'm paraphrasing or something.
Why?
It's like the car, you know. years before his time, it was individual freedom, and they could get out and do things, have independent lives, all that.
So let's think, what would have preceded bicycles as a mode of transportation?
Feet or horses.
Horse.
Yeah, so if you have a horse and you're a lady and you have a tight corset so how do you saddle that sucker?
With a big ladder, I guess.
Sit on the side like this.
No, well, how do you even
Stagecoach.
get the saddle on a horse?
Stagecoach.
How heavy is a saddle? Anybody here done any riding?
Very, 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 very heavy.
They weigh like 30, 40 pounds, those saddles. So you literally have to hoist it up and throw it up.
Sure.
It's very vigorous. Women didn't do that. They would have to hire somebody to saddle up their horses for them. Or if they were having a buggy, it's like they couldn't pull that cart over to get the horse to pull into that spot. So they had to have somebody do this for them. But if you have a bicycle, you don't have to feed it. You don't have to have somebody saddle it for you. You don't have to do anything except climb on board and start riding. So this was really an independence thing for women. They didn't have to rely upon somebody else to get around. Now they can just hop on a bike and they can get from one part of the city to the other part of the city using their own leg power to do so. Now, bikes have been around for quite some time. We all see these pictures of these bicycles that are like this tall with great big wheels on them. Yes.
I've actually seen one before. I'm a cyclist. I went on like a charity ride. Some good buddy had an old one. They were like way up there.
Yeah.
Just scary to ride next to.
Do you
If
know
gonna tip
why
over
they
them.
did that? Why they
Oh,
had
there's-
bikes that were that big?
No, I don't. I don't know.
What do you think?
So you could see?
Why do you think I?
See against.
So it was harder for the women to get on by themselves?
No, not quite. They weren't quite that mean. About
Physics,
it.
I guess. They
No, because they were afraid that the horses would rear up and be afraid if somebody were
Okay.
riding at a lower level than
Okay.
them.
Okay.
Which wasn't true, but they felt that if the rider was at the same level as the horse, then the horse wouldn't buck up. But those bikes were incredibly dangerous. There were lots and lots of recorded incidents of people breaking limbs or breaking parts of their body. So women didn't partake in those great big bicycles. But when somebody figured out that that you could ride on a bicycle at a regular level, and they made it available for women started to take advantage of this and took it on. What do we notice as a result of that? Well, women on bicycles. That's one of the big glaring things about that. Yes.
Shorter skirts?
Yes, absolutely. The women came up with whole riding outfits for riding on bicycles. So not only did they start to wear shorter skirts, and this started to create a trend around the turn of the century where women started to wear shorter and shorter and shorter skirts until it came to just below the knee. Or they started to wear trousers. Oh my God, trousers, women in trousers, oh no, unheard of. But they had basically these, what they called pantaloons, which were kind of knickers where they would kind of tighten up at the knees, but they were pants. And they kind of ballooned out and then they tapered in at the knees, and they had these whole riding outfits that were these kind of knicker outfits. And the reason why was so that their skirts wouldn't get caught in the spokes of the bike. So women's clothing changed. But what do we notice about this woman here? I mean, despite the fact that she's wearing a short skirt, do we see her as being scandalous?
Either that or it must be really cold
No.
outside.
No.
I bet that was very scandalous though.
Yeah.
back then.
So what tells us that this woman is being...
She's showing her calves.
Yes, but they're stockinged, so they're not even bare skin. Do we see any skin on her other than her face?
Nope.
No. So she's really, really well clad. I mean, even her hair is tied up into a hat. Her blouse is buttoned all the way up to underneath her chin. She's wearing cuffs that come all the way down. She's wearing gloves. She's wearing spats and on top of her shoes, and so we don't really see anything other than the shape of her limbs in this. And this really kind of points to a big difference between what was happening in the United States and what was happening in Europe at this time. Because for the folks that were living in the United States, this was considered really kind of out there as far as women's fashion goes. This woman was considered progressive, and she was pushing the edge of propriety, of what was proper in this period of time, just because this is a very uptight period of time in the United States. If we look at the same kind of ad, 1896 here, we're looking at an ad in the United States for a bicycle, and we compare it to a bicycle in Paris, owned by Alphonse Mucha at the same time. What differences do we have here?
Look at those arms. She's a bodybuilder. Look at her arms, like gun show. Like, despite everything else.
So this too is an advertisement for a bicycle. We don't even see the bicycle. We didn't see the bicycle in the other ad.
Yeah, you can't see the handlebars.
We see the handlebars, right? But like
Some of
even
the
here,
front.
we don't really see the bicycle. We're seeing the idea of the woman selling the bicycle. So what they're saying is, be as progressive women out there, if you ride a Stearns, you'll be a happy woman. In Paris, this is a woman riding a bicycle. I don't know what the amble is about. But she is so in love with her bicycle that she's falling out of her dress. I mean, that's how much she loves riding bicycles in Paris at this time. But you can definitely see that there's a different attitude in Europe versus what there is in the United States. And this is the sexuality aspect that's coming out in art, especially in Europe, more so than it is in the United States. And we can speculate a lot of reasons why this was. I mean, one, America was founded on the principles of this kind of really rigid kind of religious state. And it may very well be that we've never quite gotten over it. But it also might have something to do with the proximity of people in Europe and the prevalence of those ukiyo-es. They were definitely seeing more of them. They were putting them on display more in Europe than what they were in the United States. What were you going to say, Shaden?
The last poster, was that an American poster?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is designed by Edward Penfield, the American who designed the covers for Harper's publications. So American designer here, and then European, Alphonse Mucha, European French designer here. So very different attitudes. To this very day, if you go to Europe, you're going to see advertisements that show a lot more nudity in them than what they do in the United States. Yes.
And in London at this time, were they doing more progressive things like Alphonse Mucha, or were they doing more like American, like?
We're going to look at this guy to answer that question.
As far as women go, though.
Yeah, we're going to look at Aubrey Beardsley because he's going to tell us that yes, indeed, they are getting more progressive in the way that they do designs. Let's just finish out this little bit right here about European designers, because this attitude, the difference between the American attitude towards all things European versus what the European view was on art, we're going to see that come again. We're going to butt heads with it again as we get into the 19-teens. Something called the Armory Show that comes to the United States that's showing all the latest and greatest of art happening in Europe at that time. And Europeans were grabbing onto it, were loving all of this new art that was coming out in Europe, and when it came to the United States, they panned it. The critics in New York, in Chicago, in the big cities, Boston, they all had nasty things to say about this Armory Show as it traveled around the United States, whereas in Europe, they totally embraced all the new art that was coming about. So this kind of prudish and this backwards kind of mentality fits into the more of the model that we're going to talk about with the United States as we move along. For now, the next person that we want to talk about is a guy named Aubrey Beardsley. So we've already talked about Edward Penfield, now we're going to talk about Aubrey Beardsley. Aubrey Beardsley was a very young designer, and he was considered, there's a word that they used for him to describe him. He was self-proclaimed, actually. He called himself an enfant terrible, which is French, but he was British. But translating that out, does anybody know what enfant terrible would possibly mean?
Sacre bleu.
Terrible baby.
Yeah, terrible child. He was an awful child. Meaning that he would push the edges of propriety for the sake of pushing the edges. He would have a temper tantrum or be mean or do nasty things just for the sake of getting people riled up.
Oh, like bad kid. That's the modern interpretation.
Bad kid. Good picture of him.
He looks focused.
But the thing about Aubrey Beardsley is there was a reason why he chose to be this bad child, and that was because he was suffering from tuberculosis.
Oh dear.
So if you are diagnosed, and he was diagnosed as a child with tuberculosis in that time, that was a fatal disease. So you probably would not live to see your 20s. He lived to be 28 years old, so he lived pretty long for somebody with TB, but all the same, he knew that he was on the verge of dying any day now. And so he decided, what I got to lose? I'm just going to go for it. And because his style, and this is his style as far as the illustration goes, because his style was so noteworthy, people hired him to do lots of stuff. So he was hired to do illustrations for a lot of publications. I should say that, as we pointed out, Versacrum was very, very popular, but there were a lot of other publications that were happening at this time. The Studio was one of them, and then there was another one called Yellow Book, and there were others that were out at this time. Lots and lots of magazines. Harper's was certainly a newspaper that was being published, but then there was Punch magazine and lots and lots that were going around, and they were all different journals talking about arts and the things that they would discuss in salons. Because if you think about this time, there were not a lot of newspapers, there were not a lot of, there wasn't television, there wasn't radio, there wasn't broadcast anywhere, so the only way that you could get things, find out what was going on in other places was through reading them. So they had all these journals that people would trade from one country to the next and read up what was going on. What's going on in Vienna right now? Well, let's read Versacrum, we'll find out. Or what's going on in Great Britain? Well, let's read the Studio and we can find out. So they were all trading from country to country, all of these different publications, and people were keeping up with the arts that way. In the case of Aubrey Beardsley, his illustrations were used for a lot of different purposes. There's a playwright in London that was very popular in this day. His name was Oscar Wilde, and he was producing plays and writing books and so on. He hired Aubrey Beardsley to do a lot of his stuff. Now, if we look at what Aubrey Beardsley is doing here, we can see that there's some similarities in his style to what William Morris was doing when he did the Kelmscott Press books. And indeed, this is the same period of time that Kelmscott Press books were coming out. He was very influenced by that. He thought they were remarkably beautiful in the way that they were illustrated and laid out, but he also felt that they needed to have a little bit more austerity to them. So we notice that although there's a lot of detail on the outside borders of what's going on, the illustration that's contained within is very, very clean. So he liked to do this mix and match of patterns that were sort of like the rooms that William Morris was doing. So we had a lot of big white open spaces, and then we had lots of patterns. And that's what's happening here with what Aubrey Beardsley did. Aubrey Beardsley worked almost primarily in black and white in almost all of his stuff, and we can definitely see influences of the Japanism in the pieces that he was doing. So here we've got the very flattened spaces, and we've got the things floating around in space, and definitely no tonal ranges going on, and the patterning that's going on in the pieces, very intricate and delicate, but at the same time very bold. Contrast was really high in the pieces that he was creating. Now, the thing about what he did and why people really were paying attention to him was not just because of these illustrations, but because of illustrations like this. He was very into gory images, and these are very tame. He was also not afraid of nudity, and so he often would show female nudity in the pieces that he was doing, or full male nudity. And the examples that I'm giving you here are very, very tame in comparison to some of the ones that he did. So you could certainly go and look up some of his work and see some things that are pretty genuinely pornographic. Again, bad boy. But he didn't care. He just really was trying to push the edge of what was right in Great Britain at that time. And so by associating himself with Oscar Wilde, he kind of pushed himself, that in itself, into an area that was considered kind of risque. Oscar Wilde was homosexual, and he was pretty open about it. But in London, and up until just recently, actually, in London, to be self-proclaimed homosexual was considered illegal. And you could go to jail for it. Oscar Wilde went to jail because he was caught in the act of a homosexual act in London at one point. And Aubrey Beardsley, by hanging out with him, was automatically considered to be, maybe homosexual as well. Then there were the other folks that said that Aubrey Beardsley was having an incestuous affair with his sister, so who knows. But one way or another, he was considered to be bad. But again, he knew that he didn't have long to live, so he really just wanted to make people create this kind of push in British society and make people argue about this stuff, bring it to the forefront, and be political in some ways. Sadly, as I said, he died at, I said 28, he died at the age of 26. But in the last couple of years of his life, he was pretty much an invalid, and he ended up converting to Catholicism in those last years, and so his design started to take on this very kind of serene look, and still using a lot of drama, a lot of contrast in his work, but ultimately he settled down as far as what his imagery went to the last few things that he produced. I should also say that for the studio, for Yellow Book, he was hired as editors for those publications and never held the job for more than a year. So he just because he kept on arguing with people and wanting to do things that you just couldn't show on the cover. So people had a hard time with him. But his style was very elegant and beautiful, especially the contrast of it. In the United States, there was a designer who capitalized on this quality that Aubrey Beardsley had. His name was Will Bradley, and a lot of people called him the American Aubrey Beardsley, just because his style was so similar to what Aubrey Beardsley was doing. Except that in his particular case, he wasn't pushing the edge like Beardsley was. He wasn't purposely going out there and showing nudity or male genitalia or any of that stuff in his stuff. He just like the quality, the line quality that Aubrey Beardsley did. He would incorporate it. He also developed some techniques that were really interesting. He learned how to create repetitious patterns that he could replicate easily and quickly in his stuff, so that they were still lithographed, and this was before photo typesetting and photo reproduction could be done. But he figured out a way to do replication of shapes and forms in his lithographic pieces. We can also see that he was very much taking the idea of Japanism to a new level, where we have this repeating background of this the pattern very much like what William Morris would do, and then we have the figures that are kind of plunked there, and very solid forms of color, no shadows, no delineation. So a very interesting perspective that Will Bradley had. Inland Printer was another one of those publications that was posted at that time, as well as Chapbook, and Will Bradley did posters and covers for both of those. This is really interesting in that we're really moving into territory where we're no longer seeing influence of Alphonse Mucha or Jules Charest, but now artists are starting to develop their own styles. And Will Bradley's stuff, we're definitely seeing that here, where no longer we have the black outline, now we have a white outline around the forms. And we can see that the typography is being completely obscured in some places with the parts of the illustration, and other places the illustrator is doing some really interesting things, like taking the word Thanksgiving and dividing it in two. Thanksgiving, and the is being tucked into the word, into the letter form of the C there. Really interesting compositions that he's creating. Here we have another one where he's, again, creating this kind of montage of pattern into the work that he's doing. So we've got this Pegasus that just keeps on repeating over and over again, or images like this, where, again, we can definitely see elements of Aubrey Beardsley in his work, but now definitely colorful and bright. So Will Bradley was very wildly successful in the United States, also as an Art Nouveau artist. Last, ones I want to show you of Art Nouveau in the United States are two guys. Their names were William Nicholson and James Pride, but they went by the name the Beggarstaffs, or the Beggarstaff brothers even. So they changed around a little bit. So sometimes they were just the Beggarstaff, sometimes they were the Beggarstaff brothers. They weren't really brothers. They were just buddies. They were actually in-laws. So brothers-in-law married to two sisters, kind of like Margaret and Frances and their husbands. Kind of that same kind of relationship that Herbert McNair and Charles Rennie Mackintosh had to each other. That's what the Beggarstaff brothers were. They were also both fine artists, so they had careers already established for themselves as fine artists. And when we move into this time, they decided to do some commercial work. They had the opportunity to pick up some commercial work, and they decided to do this. And this is an interesting point of perspective, because I think I might have started talking about this the other day, and if I did, forgive me, but I'm going to repeat myself. Artists at this time were moving away from thinking that the only way that they could make a living was by painting paintings. They had started to realize that they could move into the commercial arts. And so we see lots of examples of fine artists that are doing this, moving into commercial arts. So Toulouse-Lautrec was a really good example of that. He had studied to be a fine art painter. And yet at the same time we know that he was doing posters for the Moulin Rouge and other clubs in the Montmartre district of Paris. So he was definitely stepping into this new territory. Alphonse Mucha had originally been a painter, but he stepped in to do some commercial work in order to help out his friend on Christmas Eve, and then that launched his career as a graphic artist. And so on, we see artists that are stepping into this territory to the point where we actually see that they are signing their names to their stuff. And if you go back and you look at every piece that we've looked at, every single one of these folks has signed their name to their work. Do commercial artists sign their names to their work now? Do graphic designers put their name on any of the stuff that they do?
No, somebody else owns
No.
it usually.
No. That's not the reason why. Why do you think artists don't do that anymore? Graphic artists. Aren't we artists? In some way, shape, or form, aren't we considered artists? These guys thought that they were artists, that yet they signed their stuff to commercial work.
Or they just put copyright on it, don't they, instead? Or
No.
BT.
The reason for it is because there was a turnaround that happened shortly after this. When we get to Pablo Picasso, we can blame him for this. He was the one that advocated the idea that artists are artists and commercial artists are commercial artists. Graphic artists are not the same as fine artists. And so they started to separate themselves from the time that, very shortly after this period, when we get into the 1900s, 1906, 1904, 1906, that's when Picasso and a bunch of his buddies all say, we're fine artists and commercial artists shouldn't be taking advantage of our work. And so they made a big stink about it, and artists, from that time forward, commercial artists stopped signing their stuff because they were selling to a commercial product. They weren't showing their work anymore, they were showing work for commercial product. And that was the big division as far as the fine arts considered it. And it's taken a long time to get over that. We're starting to see, and there have always been some commercial artists who sign their names, but for the most part, we haven't seen a lot of commercial arts and fine arts that commercial arts that actually sign their names to stuff. Changing, but it's taken a long time. In this particular case, these guys were fine artists, and they decided that they were going to call themselves the Beggar Staff. They could have signed their stuff William Nicholson and James Pryde, but they decided that it would be easier if they just created a pseudonym for themselves, and they called themselves the Beggar Staffs instead, and signed their stuff that way. And for them, they felt like this was a saving grace because they really were not very successful as commercial artists. There were only a handful of things that they were doing, but for us, when we look at their stuff, we recognize that this is not typical of Art Nouveau. How is this different from Art Nouveau? Let's start. We'll start in a different chapter. How is it similar to Art Nouveau?
It's new art.
Yeah.
That's some of the Japanese forms, and it's sort of like face is obscured and
The flattened forms, the floating space, right? Christopher, what were you going to say when I asked that question before? How is this different from Art Nouveau?
The stuff in the foreground kind of blends in with the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have this kind of mesh that's happening where the colors, they kind of bleed over into each other. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, it's called gestalt. When we have one color that bleeds into, the colors kind of fill in, and our eye is meant to continue that shape, but we don't actually see the outlines on it. In fact, in this painting, in this conceptual image, we don't really see outlines in this. We see large blocks of shape, and maybe this little white line right here, but up at the top, we don't really see where her hair is coming together on the other side of her cape. And we can see that happening in other places as well, where the shape of the figure is melting into the shape of the horse. So it's all the same color line. The background is bleeding into the frame of the picture. So really interesting idea, this concept of Gestalt, and it's very ahead of its time. Gestalt is actually a psychological term, and we don't really see it applied in design until another 10 years from this is when we start to see this really start to pick up. But at this time, the beggar staffs, and this is really the reason why they weren't successful. Their stuff didn't look Art Nouveau-ish. It didn't look like any of the other stuff. Even Will Bradley's, as different as it was, even as different as Aubrey Beardsley's stuff was, you can still see some of the qualities, the traits of Japanism and the outlined forms and the flattened patterns and so on in the work that was being done. This is taking a far step away from it. And so the only reason I bring these guys up is because they are ahead of the game, and they're going to be the trendsetters. Even though they were not successful as commercial artists, even though there's only a few pieces of their things that we can look at, we can still point to their stuff and say, oh, they were doing groundbreaking stuff. Here's a really good example of the idea, that concept of Gestalt. So see how his shoulder, there's no line at the top of his right shoulder, and at the sides of his uniform, his beefeater uniform, or even the fronts of his shins, it all kind of melts into the background. That's Gestalt, where the eye is meant to continue the shape even though it's not all there. And it's actually a psychological term that was developed and then it got applied to graphic arts. So in any case, the beggar staffs were 20 years ahead of their time, at least 10 years. I know I can point to examples 10 years later that start to pick up on theirs, but they did influence other people. And that's all I've got to show you for today. So are there any questions?